It's nearly Christmas, a perfect time for a game filled with sand. Deserts of Kharak is a Homeworld spin-off game, a prequel taking place before the space journey. This sounds like a strange move for a series whose gameplay is mainly known for its 3D space combat. Now our feet are firmly planted into the ground. The first game's story was something that could be translated into another setting with broad strokes, and this is kind of that. While you do get more out of it from having played the original game, it's not necessary. In fact, playing this beforehand could make going into the first Homeworld blind a lot more impactful. Usually release order is the way to go with most games, but this is a rare case where I'm not sure which I would recommend first. Gameplay-wise it's simpler, but other games expand on these mechanics. You then go into them familiar with aspects like the Sensors Manager before full space combat. Also, since it's chronologically the beginning of the story, it doesn't rely on you knowing any greater context. At least in theory. If you have played the original, you'll understand a lot more of why the story is happening. But if you are a manual lore beard, you'll notice there have been some adjustments here and there to make it happen. So for the time being, I'll assume you haven't played other Homeworld games or seen my previous videos. I'll compare some mechanics here and there, but I'll save the nitty-gritty for the spoiler section. Without context, it would mainly be nonsense anyways.
Kingdom Hearts 2 has screwed us again!
The story begins on the wasteland planet of Kharak. There are a few habitable zones across the world, and these shrink every year as the desert expands. One of the satellites from a northern faction detects a strange object deep in the harshest desert. It's emitting an absurd amount of energy, so an expedition is sent to investigate it. This ended up being a bit of a rush job, and everyone was assumed to have died horribly. So after some years of better planning, a second expedition is about to begin. There are many clans or Kith in the Northern Coalition, but this expedition is mainly led by Kith Sajet. Most notable is Chief Science Officer Rachel Sajet, whose brother Jacob died in the first trip. The anomaly could be the key to saving the planet, but there's no telling until you get there. The distance is so vast and the journey so obviously dangerous that a massive vehicle was designed for this trip, which is saying something since the land crawlers can be pretty damn big already, but for this they have created a heavily modified, mortal engine-sized land carrier, the Capisi. This will carry the smaller craft through harsher climates and has facilities to build or research even more. So after a brief driver's ed lesson, it's off to the desert to possibly save the world. However, not every clan is on board for this plan, especially the exiled Kith Galcian. These ghosts of the desert have somehow survived in its harshest regions and are furious at the intrusion. This isn't only a territorial issue, as the Galcian are religious zealots. They once fought and lost a religious war against Kith Sadim. Sadim is part of the Northern Coalition, which already adds more tension, but the Alliance as a whole has been pissing off the Galcian with their heresy. The god Sejuk is wrathful, and so are they.
For generations, you have violated the first commandment of our Creator by entering into space. You seek the stars. Now you invade our lands for the second time. Diplomacy has failed. We can tolerate this no longer. The suffering of this war will be nothing compared to the wrath of Sejuk. Long live the people of Kharak.
It'll be fine, desert invasions always go well. And I think that about covers it for now. So let's talk about the graphics and some other strangeness. When it comes to art direction, there's a lot I like about the game. All the Coalition vehicles are industrial brick shithouses, but there's still a sleekness to them. You get the sense they're designed to be super utilitarian rather than anything pleasing in mind. Plus any little greeble bits and pieces would likely be ripped off by Kharak's hellish sandstorms. It does have that Supreme Commander effect where sometimes I forget the scale these things are operating at, where your light attack vehicle dune buggies are actually the size of a semi-truck, and your basic tank is roughly the size of a house. Hell, the shell casings alone might be big enough to qualify for a mortgage. They're more like heavy construction vehicles, and they might have started that way, hauling ore and other valuable materials from the unlivable parts of the desert to the habitable zones. The vehicles are huge, but generally built wide over tall. They're all about maximum stability, being wide enough not to be threatened by bumps in the road, but not tall enough that a huge sandstorm could knock them down. Even as new vehicles roll off the line in all kinds of different forms, they maintain this clean industrial look to them. They only start to break the mold a little bit later as they include Galcian technology into their arsenal. Unlike the Coalition, the Galcian have been in the deep desert for generations. They've been scavenging some secrets out there too, as they're massively advanced. They don't need gigantic wheels or overlong tracks since they mastered anti-gravity. So in contrast, their craft is generally smaller but highly advanced, efficient, and nimble, which is exactly what you want when hit and run is at the center of your doctrine. While the Coalition units can physically look to be struggling moving through the sand, the Galcian have ascended beyond giving any shit about it. They move through the desert perfectly smoothly. Not only do the designs complement and contrast the factions fantastically, but just the way they move reinforces who's an outsider. Now, because of the scale of the vehicles and the landscape itself, it's not treated like conventional ground warfare. You're already operating out of a carrier, and the larger vehicles are referred to as cruisers. Kharak's Dune Sea really is its ocean, and besides being a way to add that extra lore and character into the game, it also ties it into the rest of the franchise, and the Sensors Manager feels right at home here. I mean, Homeworld has always had some top-tier vehicle designs, and this doesn't break that gold standard. They did great not only making all these vehicle designs, but properly integrating them into the world too. The physics of how they move around, the tracks left in the sand, the way the weapons can kick up soil and the particle effects of explosions. For a non-AAA RTS game, it can look pretty great at times. The biggest issues are technical ones. There are visual bugs that can happen often enough that it's worth a mention, and the frame rate can absolutely dive at points, and this has happened to me on a few PCs over many years now, so it's probably an engine issue. The anti-aliasing is also bad enough to be very noticeable, and the shadows can be blocky and flickering, especially in close-up cutscenes. You can't override or tweak these either, so you're stuck with it. It's especially disappointing when you compare the settings here with the Homeworld remaster, which, to be fair, it's a whole other engine, a completely different deal. However, in the remaster, you have all kinds of options for rebinding keys, like most PC games, especially a strategy one. So it is downright bizarre you can't rebind any keys in Deserts of Kharak. I've played some other RTS games that were way older that did this, so seeing this in a relatively recent one was a surprise. Though at this rate, if the game isn't actively trying to brick my PC, I think I can tolerate it. As for the cutscenes, they expanded to that painting look the remasters had. They're more colorful, and the scenes can be physically with the characters more than they have been before, which isn't a whole ton, but they use a live-action conversion effect which can look awkward at points, but it still feels faithful. Honestly, that sentence alone sums up the whole game. Even with its drawbacks and shakier moments, it still plays and feels like a Homeworld title. This is especially noticeable in the audio. The Professionals Under Stress voice acting is back in full force, with some additional variations here and there. Units can be more detailed in calling out specifically what they're guarding or attacking. Beyond that, each unit has a lot of background audio chatter that'll play throughout the game, just like you'd expect.
Showing no hostile contacts at this time. Please confirm.
Railgun copies. Checking. And all clear.
Running assist check on assembly array again, just to be sure.
Operators, please confirm negative contacts in your area.
Just finishing a sweep. Yeah, all clear. Hostile strike craft down. Counter! Adjusting fire. Ready! Full speed! Target! Readjust! Rain fire on! Sightline clear. Returning fire.
Once again, this layers perfectly into the battle soundscape, which already sounds great on its own when it comes to effects like weapons fire. They can even have different reverbing effects based on distance, and turning a nerd into a particle yet known to science has never sounded better.
Solid vicinity. Fire well. Roger that. Adjusting fire.
The music also deserves special attention because, besides its variety, there is a ton of it. And sure, a lot of the tracks are very brief or parts that mix into other music dynamically, but there's also a good amount of music from previous games. Sometimes a little motif or flourish will creep its way in and can be easy to miss. Then there are times where a track can come in at full swing, which already sounds appropriate to the moment, but if you've played the previous games, the presence of these tracks can evoke a lot more in you. These are almost exclusively used when you're learning more about the greater story. The rest of the game is being carried by the new music, which is still being led by the original game's composer, Paul Ruskay. It's a combination of strings and traditional Indian instruments and vocals, and by far has the highest production value on display in the series. Except for yes, the remaster didn't get them back for some reason. The new music still has excellent variety and can be as bombastic or as tragic as ever. The easiest way I can put it is, the Mizmars have been unleashed.
Fire. Enemy armor disabled. Support crews are under attack. Immediate fire support on that position. Hostiles designated. Trackers assigned. Reposition. Enemy armor disabled. Ready. Armor vehicle taking effective fire. Fast attack pattern. Full speed. Hostile.
Position.
Armored vehicle lost. Ready. Bring us around. Repair protocols active. Hostile strike craft down.
Receiving.
Hit it. Armor sensors post is under fire. Go for ranged.
Control group 4 designated.
Alert. Rachel is in contact.
EMP. Fire.
Hostile armor eliminated.
It can become this strange blend of traditional instruments and synth and strings. It all comes together fantastically, and this game has some of my favorite music in the series now. There are some occasional pops or crackles in the audio, but they're fairly rare. As for what was intended, I really only have good things to say. When it comes to mechanics, there's a lot more to get into. Outside of the tutorial, the game has 13 missions and 3 different difficulties. Classic for sure gives a decent challenge, and there have been times where I had to restart a mission a few times. For the most part, it's not overly brutal, and there's no dynamic difficulty like some other homeworlds had. Getting through it will mean needing to learn at least a few hotkeys and the in and outs of the game's tactics. Your fleet of vehicles will persist throughout the campaign, but from the main menu you can always load up a default fleet, which won't be ideal, but does save you from having to go back farther. As for the fleet itself, the carrier is both your headquarters and your most powerful unit, but you can't use its full potential all at once. See, the carrier is a resource drop-off point, it builds new units, it researches new stuff, your standard RTS affair. However, the carrier also has a power shunting system. You have a set energy supply that you can redirect to various onboard modules. You can increase the range of sensors and weapons, buff up the armor, activate repair beams, or use a combination, though the more power you have in a system, the more effective it'll be. There's also temperature to worry about, and unfortunately, Kharak is burning. If you overheat a module, you'll get the effect, but the carrier will take damage over time and eventually explode. You lose the carrier, you lose the game. Same goes for Rachel. As the campaign goes on, you'll get set improvements to your power and your cooling, but more treasures can be found by digging through the trash. The deep deserts of Kharak have mysterious shipwrecks among them. It's clear that salvaging and studying them are how the Galcian have become so advanced since they weren't pulling MIT degrees out of sandcastles. The Galcian revere and carefully study these relics. We don't have time for that shit.
There it goes.
The Northern Coalition uses the gentle, archaeological touch of the Kool-Aid Man. The wrecks are violently exploded through a process called shipbreaking, scattering precious resources all over the ground and presumably sending some mummified corpses into deep space. Homeworld games previously only had one resource, and Deserts of Kharak has 2. The orange construction units, or CUs, which are your basic building block. The other are the blue resource units, or RUs, which have been in all the other games. In those, this is your one and only basic material for creating spacecraft, but here it's in a new context as rare and exotic elements. These ancient wrecks have many secrets to unlock, and saving that, their armor plating is much better than yours. This means your more powerful units and technology are going to require some. Your basic salvagers can pick them up all the same, it's just a matter of finding them. You can sometimes find them across the land without needing to shipbreak, but sometimes these wrecks will reveal an artifact. Not only can these buff up your carrier with additional power and stat bonuses, but they can improve just about anything in the entire arsenal. Which ones drop and whether or not they drop does depend on some RNG. You won't get them all in a single campaign run, but they do persist just like your fleet does. The effects these have can be substantial enough to make you completely change up your tactics. Your basic tanks could cost less and be more survivable, or your aircraft can be faster and hit harder. Artifacts are a fun, neat little bit of variation that can mix up your playthroughs. As for the moment-to-moment fighting, they did try to make up for the lack of 3D space combat. Since the action is taking place on a 2D plane, they chose to make the terrain itself a big factor. Whether or not a unit can attack depends greatly on a clear line of sight. A unit being able to attack in an arc, even if it's a temporary ability, can be huge. If you do take the high ground, you not only have a clear line of sight, but you also get bonuses to damage and accuracy. It's kind of like the ground control series, but not quite that interesting or insane.
Yeah, no more burgers for the Terrans.
Not yet. Anyways, elevation being a factor does make the combat a lot more engaging. The endless dunes are also endless opportunities for ideal positioning. But advancing forward will inevitably put your troops into the low ground as well. The slow climb up a hill can make your units an easy mark for enemy artillery or aircraft or other surprises. There's also the fact that you could get a good high ground position on an enemy strike force, and then they flank you from an even taller hill. It's not a special zone you enter into, you need to be thinking relative.
Oh, sorry, I was thinking relative. I was thinking relative again. Yeah, I was thinking relative. Yeah, I keep thinking relative.
Smart positioning rewards you with victories in battle and seeing your vehicles do mad hops over the hills. Speaking of them, compared to Homeworld proper, they are a simplified roster. There's some rock, paper, scissors with the core vehicles, and also some outlier units and factors to take into account, because ultimately, nothing can parry the carrier launching a cruise missile. Light attack vehicles are the fast movers that can kill and harass enemy salvagers and just get some damage on the board. The armored assault vehicle tanks can absolutely rip the LAVs to shreds. In turn, the tanks are weak to the long-range railguns. Then, the LAVs are fast and agile enough that they could get under the slow tracking of the railguns and beat them to death up close. You throw in your various air units, you have anti-air options, and then your variety of cruisers meant to obliterate anything smaller. I am oversimplifying it, but you're working with about a dozen unit types, including the carrier. More emphasis is put on individual unit tactics. Almost every unit has at least an active ability or two. Whether it's tanks popping smoke to block line of sight, the LAV's speed boost, and all other kinds of tools you unlock through research. This is pushed even further by unit veterancy having multiple tiers with all kinds of effects. A battle in Homeworld could go partially on autopilot while you bounce around the sensors menu controlling different fronts. Here, small scale engagement is the name of the game. You can't just assign some guys to a support cruiser and send them off. The repair range is much shorter than the space equivalent, and the AI isn't as well behaved. You have lots of abilities to cast and positions to move to, so you're not babysitting them needlessly, but the smaller scale makes it a more tactics-focused game. Even the signature unit capturing is reduced down to one at a time. Rachel can hack a unit that can return to the carrier with a long cooldown and for a resource cost. This can be annoying when I'm trying to collect all the honor guards, but that's the price you pay. While I don't mind the scaling down, besides the rebindable keys, it's missing a lot of quality of life features that Homeworld had. Like just being able to see my fleet composition easily at a glance. And while the action is scaled down, ironically, I feel a lot less in control. There are no formations and not much in the way of unit stances. That and this is one of those games where the pathfinding can get stuck in an obstacle. It's still fun to play and really satisfying to pull off a good flank or a combined arms maneuver, but I do feel a disconnect and less responsiveness from my forces that I didn't have in the previous games. It's overall a smooth ride, but I can feel some clunk.
The archaeological data alone would keep our scientists busy for years. I would give anything to meet the people who engineered this technology.
Talking vaguely about the story, there is something to be said about how the missions are structured. The expedition into the unknown is a template they're carrying over from Homeworld. Except how this is carried out more resembles Homeworld 2, which is largely a war story. You're crossing over absolute oceans of sands and history. And with the exception of a single mission, you are always fighting the Gaussian. Beyond, a lack of variety, this also makes the game lack scale. Crossing a large continent, or hell, a large country, imagine how many cultures you'd come across. In Homeworld, you fight raiders and empires, religious zealots, ancient anomalies, and sometimes just the hazards of the environment itself. This keeps things fresh and actually gives you the feeling of discovering new places. While you do get a few kinds of desert, fighting the Gaussian over and over makes it feel so small. There's a mission where tornadoes are a map hazard, but they're not the primary threat. And this is taking place in an area with millennia of crashed ships. You could do all kinds of stuff with this. There could be a weird insulated survivor culture in one of the wrecks. Maybe one of these was carrying drones or bioweapons or some kind of other science experiment. Even forgetting the wrecks, how about a group of raiders around a reservoir? Maybe there are Soban mercenary breakoffs, just anything. I guess my point is, when Odysseus got lost at sea, he didn't keep landing on an island with a Cyclops. What missions you do get are your RTS regulars. There are some that take advantage of all the game's mechanics and give you a lot of options, but not nearly enough, and it's already short for a strategy game. It could have benefited from some short, simple missions that also help with that scale. Like, maybe there's a massive sandstorm and the Capisi has to travel through a dangerous ravine with enemies in the cliffside. The issue now is the number of mechanics outrun the missions. This is most noticeable when Mission 10 just dumps research on you. Brand new vehicles and abilities for them, abilities for what you have already. It's so abrupt I can't shake the sense more was planned. As for the writing itself, it does try to set up a lot which won't pay off until the other games. The greater implications they add to the story are interesting and sometimes confusing. A lot of the character drama does fall flat to me, and we've run into another old issue. Homeworld and Cataclysm had wonderful manuals, but you didn't need to read them to enjoy the game. Homeworld 2's manual was brief about the lore, but it had a 30-page PDF on the CD. This gives a lot of context that really needed to be in the game properly, but even with it, it's still a messy story. This time around, we have a fully interactive expedition guide, and it keeps up that spirit of being in the setting. As usual, there's lots of cool stuff here. You can learn about the history and culture of the planet and the Kith. There's an interactive map of the planet and expedition, a timeline, a viewer of all the vehicles in the game, and lots of behind-the-scenes stuff. Maybe most importantly, Rachel Sajet has a lot of character history and development here that's only vaguely hinted at in the game, or reveals that could have come up in the game but instead are meaningless. Like, the second expedition was launched early just to distract the Gaussian. This could have been twisted even more, like maybe finding the object was the Capisi's secondary objective, and the real one was wiping out Gaussian leadership. This could have given Rachel and the others some interesting conflict, and made it stand out from the one-purpose journey from Homeworld 1. The expedition guide has good story elements, they just don't show up in the actual story. But the worst part is, this isn't something you access from the main menu, it's a separate program that you pay for. When it's not on sale, the manual costs you $6, which is a gearbox of an idea. If this was in the main menu, it would not only be well received, it would have also gotten people more interested in the Homeworld franchise. Someone could have read it and then went out and bought more of your games. Instead, it's an obscure application that they want people to pay for, which is beyond stupid to me. To give some consolation, this doesn't magically make the game's story better. It gives an explanation for some strange events, but not a whole lot of depth. I'm getting into spoilers now, so if you don't want those, go to here. Okay, first let me get this out of the way. For me, a lot of the mysticism of Homeworld was carried by them finding a single ship in the desert saying that they weren't alone and this wasn't their home. Their exile was so far and their punishment so severe that no one else came to check in on them, besides the Tidan just paying off some raiders to monitor the system. Now that a large part of Kharak is essentially the Space Bermuda Triangle, that seems a lot less special now. Anyway, here are the broad strokes. After the Capήσεις launched the Galcian attack, they destroy the base it came from and many others, they lay siege to the Northern Coalition capital. It's not like everyone behind you is completely dead, but it seems to want to capture that tone. You're also not completely alone because a Kith Sidim carrier also escaped. They're always out to murder the Galcian anyways, and they flank you on your journey. There are several missions where you battle side by side, you directly save their carrier, and they prove themselves to be a valuable ally. Again, this also makes the campaign feel more like a war instead of an adventure. On discovering the carcass of the first expedition's carrier, Rachel's brother, the first officer Jacob, has been alive longer than she thought. He was on the path to finding something which isn't clear, but there are clues. While there are wrecks that clearly plummeted down onto the surface, not all of them are this way. Some of them are in nearly pristine condition or entombed inside of solid rock. They couldn't have possibly crashed here, they materialized here. Why this is happening is never actually said directly. What is clear is that this is once again the work of one of those magical hyperspace cores. Its energy is so powerful that it was affecting ships passing by in orbit, either causing their hyperdrives to malfunction and rematerialize inside the planet, or it simply pulled them down to get bonked. Whether it was rigged to do this before the exile, or it's malfunctioning, or the will of Sejuk, it's not known. Jacob was captured by the Galcian, but he learned about the core's most notable victim. It's a Tidan carrier, but due to the lack of information they have, they just think the carrier was called the Tidan. While the Galcian were picking through the wreckage with reverence, there were some things they simply didn't understand. One of these being the trigger for a powerful weapon, which Jacob yoinked before escaping. The Galcian believe the object's site, the Kartoba, will allow their leader to rule the world if he simply enters it. Sadly, the Galcian are having trouble with this.
Oh my god.
The Tidan had partially fulfilled the mission.
The ID transponder signal originated from a wreck. A military capital ship that seems to be named Tidan. The Tidan deployed the orbital weapon, then suffered the same fate as the other wrecks, crashing to the surface before the weapon could be enabled. Escaping the Galcian base, Jacob crossed the wastelands and located the Tidan. Coupled with the transponder hidden aboard this ship, he used the trigger to arm the weapon. But without adequate food, water, or protection, he died here. Alone.
This reveal makes the Tidan bigger bastards than they already were. On a galactic level, the satellite is a pretty small weapon, but when they deployed it earlier in Kharak history, it was likely a way to sneakily exterminate the people. So you need to retrieve the transponder to not be zapped from orbit, but you and the Sidim stop for an aerial resupply at the last landing strip for thousands of miles. It's the final stretch of the journey.
To our coalition brothers and sisters, you have inflicted great devastation upon the Galcian scum. For that, we applaud your bravery. We will not forget your sacrifice. But our time of ascension is at hand. Only the Sidim and our Kithsa are of divine origin. Only we can claim the bounty that lies at the heart of this desert. The first city and its secrets belong to us, and us alone.
This cutscene is executed and framed gorgeously, but what? The few bits of history I told you about the Sidim were all from the Expedition Guide. The gritty details are that the Galcian believe that people were placed on Kharak by Sejuk purely to suffer. Venturing into space is escaping his divine punishment, so it's heretical. As for the Sidim, they believe their bloodline is divine. They alone are descended from God, and everyone else is a native of the planet. Their history is filled with brutal examples of their caste system and how they treat any non-Sidim clan. The game itself has a character going, "Those Sidim sure are stuck up." In context, this is like someone saying, "Yeah, apartheid was kind of lame." Without that context, this seems completely out of nowhere, and even with it, it still falls flat. It comes across like an excuse to give you something else to fight, even if it's for just a single mission. You fight with the Sidim for control of the transponder, and the way forward to the anomaly. The mission has one of my favorite music pieces in the game, but there's not much behind it. The The mission itself is a lot of fun, squaring off against a similar near-mirror carrier force inside of a Death Valley. The betrayal is so abrupt and cold after everything you went through that even if it makes sense canonically, it still comes across as underwhelming and not developed, especially since the game itself won't give you that context. On the other side, the Galcian have a lot more going on, which is appropriate since you see them most of the game. The details may be off, but the origin and tenets of their religion are completely correct. The truth that echoed through the ages is that the people were placed there as punishment. If they try to defy this, all will be destroyed from the heavens. This will be exactly what happens. It is similar to Homeworld 2, where a hard truth becomes magic, religion, and prophecy over time, but here it's a lot stronger because you know exactly what they're referring to. If you haven't played the original game and do after this, you see the planet you fought across get completely melted and learn that the Galcian were right. So there's an underlying tragedy to the whole campaign, but it does undercut itself slightly. They establish the fact the desert is spreading and life might not be sustainable here in a few hundred years. Making it a doomed world cuts out the Galcian idea that they can settle there forever. At the same time, the Galcian are your enemy, and they want to sit there and accept punishment for events they had nothing to do with. Still, when you reach the Kartoba site and face off against them, it is for the fate of the planet. They've come with all their might and their flagship, which absolutely pukes out units on classic difficulty, by the way.
Galcian air units inbound.
In your final victory, even if you don't know what's coming, it still ends on a tragic note.
Seek his forgiveness before it is too late. Step into his light and be absolved.
The final note is appropriately hopeful. Taken by itself, not much is revealed. All the wrecks they find do better explain how they're able to go toe-to-toe with other ships when they do go into the stars, but the Kartoba itself, and later bringing in the hyperspace core idea, seem to do that already. This also opens up a bunch of little lore nitpicks that I won't get into, but it does a good job setting up concepts for later games that you would only find in the manuals, even if you still need those, and there isn't much to the interpersonal stories here. After that, you can play around in the skirmish modes. For multiplayer, there are dedicated Discord groups, but overall it's pretty quiet. This is also where you'll find the game's DLC factions. The Soban, which are a remix of the Coalition, and the Knef, which are a remix of the Galcian. These came out shortly after launch, and man, I wish they were integrated into the main campaign. The vehicles and tech are slight remixes of the usual suspects, and the carriers have new powers and systems to play with. If you're not invested in the skirmish modes, these packs are skippable. Skirmish doesn't have a lot of maps, and only one game mode beyond the Annihilations. You'll either become super invested in this, or bounce off hard like most people do after the campaign. It can be fun, but I've never been tempted to boot up this game again for Skirmish like I have with some other RTS games. For me, it gets repetitive too fast, and even with DLC packs, there's just not enough variety to really carry it. As for the main game, it'll be 90% off on GOG for a while in the pinned link. I think Deserts of Kharak is a good game, but I can't help but imagine how great it could be if it just had more time. The art design and music and tone, it's all there and fantastic. The gameplay is there too with solid ideas, it just felt like it needed more polishing beyond just all the bugs. Even with the shortcomings, it is a proper Homeworld game. If you never tried or liked those because they were too intimidating, you might like this one a lot, and could find them easier to understand after playing the ground game. It's rare to have a prequel where mechanics are simplified, but in a way that flows better into the games that came before. They expanded on some elements to make it engaging, but not overwhelming. It could have been better, but a space game managing to successfully shift like this is impressive. If you're new to RTS games, or like Homeworld a lot, there are plenty of good reasons to check it out. All I know is we need more giant landcrawler games. The imagery of these capture my imagination. Well, have a great holiday season, and consider watching the greatest Christmas movie ever made, Batman. Don't let that cover fool you. This is not a joke. This movie is high art.
What kind of toys are we making, sir?
Not toys, miss. Control panels for America's Eagle of the Sky. Our FJ-63 fighter jets.
How has the release of Dwarf Fortress affected my productivity? I've been trying to pretend I don't see it. What caused me to hate elves so much? Patient Zero was Fargoth and Morrowind, after that it became D&D experiences. One of those elf enjoyers is apparently in prison now. Wrath of the Righteous on the bracket? You bet it is. I'm going through a playthrough of it right now, actually. Though when it comes to these kinds of games, I try to poke at a few builds, and Wrath of the Righteous especially is good for replays, so the video itself is still a while off. Did I read the Story of the Ring cycle before playing the game? Not only did I not read it, I barely knew a thing about Ring. Eventually, I did watch an entire performance of the thing on YouTube in several parts. I thought maybe that would answer more, and then I went back and played the game, and it didn't help. Am I excited or fearful about the Factorio expansion? Only fear. The same Dwarf Fortress fear, actually. Games that you sit down to play for an hour, and then the sun is coming up, are so dangerous. I don't know what that expansion will have, but I'm sure it'll ruin me. Okay, I'll see you next time.